Warning: this is a true story and contains descriptions of disturbing and violent scenes that are not recommended for everyone. It was November 1934 and nearly 6 years had passed since the disappearance of a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd. Until then, police officers had not found any significant leads on Grace. But all this was before Delia Flanagan, Grace's mother, received a shocking letter from an unknown person. In this letter it was written, "Dear Mrs. Badd, I came to you on Sunday, June 3, 1928. I had brought degi paneer with strawberry flavor and had lunch with you. Grace sat on my legs and kissed me. I decided to eat him." The strange and terrifying letter that Mrs. Budd had received on that cold November evening began with an account of the life of a simple sailor who said that one day he had noticed the taste of human flesh in his mouth, and with a heart-rending account of the killing and roasting of Grace, Mrs. Budd's daughter. It was over. Although this written confession was anonymous and unsigned by the author, it was the beginning of the end of the horrific crimes of the cannibalistic serial killer named Albert Fish. Where the killer's indomitable madness and limitless thirst for blood originated, has a terrible story that is even more terrifying than the description of Grace's last days. Hamilton Howard Fish was born on May 19, 1870 to Randall and Ellen Fish in Washington, D.C. Hamilton always wanted to be named after his late brother, Albert. But many consider his decision to escape from the ugly and mocking nicknames that others, especially the children of the orphanage, put on him. After all, Albert Fish had many names, from Brooklyn Vampire, Wisteria Werewolf, and most famously, the Gray Man. Albert Fish was small in stature, quiet and simple, and had a face that, according to the Russian writer Ivan Gencherov, easily blended into the crowd. And every viewer would forget his unforgettable facial features a moment later. But besides this simple and forgettable appearance, he had a private life that terrified even the most hard-hearted people. As a child, Fish, like many members of his family, was plagued with multiple mental illnesses. Not only was his brother in a mental hospital, but his uncle was also suffering from mania. Fish's mother also had visual hallucinations. When Albert Fish was born, his father, who was 43 years apart from his mother, was 75 years old and died when Fish was only 5 years old. His widowed mother did not have enough money to take care of Albert and his other 3 siblings and left them in an orphanage. It was there that Albert felt the pleasure of pain with all his being for the first time. As he later recalled, "I always wanted to be the cause of pain in others and for others to cause pain in me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt me. I will never forget the scream and the look he gave me." The caretakers of the orphanage regularly beat the children and sometimes even encouraged them to hit each other. But while other children were always in fear of painful punishments, Fish saw pleasure in these pains. "I was about 9 years old and that's when I started my defective," he later recalled. "We were brutally whipped. I saw boys doing things they shouldn't." In this way, the young Fish once and for all mixed pain and pleasure together, a pleasure that would later lead to his sexual arousal. In 1880, when Fish's mother found favorable conditions mentally and financially enough to take her children home, she removed them from the orphanage. But the boy's soul was already completely damaged. Not only did Fish continue to self-harm after being taken from the orphanage, but in 1882 he began an unhealthy relationship with a telegraph boy. This perverted boy introduced Fish to his morbid pleasures of pooping and Albert Fish, who developed a crazed curiosity about the pain in other people during this time, wasted no time in devising the pleasures of torture. He used to sell himself in New York. He first raped the young boys he dragged out of their homes and then brutally tortured them. The spiked paddle was his favorite weapon. To his surprise, Fish got married in 1898. He married a woman whom his mother thought would be a suitable wife for Fish. The result of this marriage was 6 children. During this time, in addition to self-selling, Fish worked as a house painter to support his living expenses, while Albert Fish never resorted to abuse and violence in front of his children. He repeatedly tortured and sexually abused other children while his children were growing up. It was in 1910 that Fish met Toman Caden during a construction painting job in Delaware. Fish and Caden immediately began a sadomasochistic relationship with each other. However, it is not known to what extent Caden entered into this relationship with consent. Fish later said in his confession that Caden was probably mentally retarded. Of course, it has always been difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction in the stories that Fish described. By 1917, Fish could not do much to hide the symptoms of his mental illness. This also caused his wife to leave him. Fish's self-mutilations increased after this incident. From sticking more needles in the groin to even sticking a woolen cloth dipped in lighter gas in the buttock and setting it on fire. At the same time, he had auditory hallucinations. In one period, he even wrapped himself in a carpet, which according to him, he followed exactly the instructions of John the Apostle in this work, which he apparently did for the purification of sins. Shortly before Albert Fish's death, he confessed that he was the one who lured Frances into the woods and later attacked and strangled him. He admitted that he wanted to dismember her body like other victims, but he quickly ran away from the scene of the murder when he heard a sound. Finally, Albert Fish was executed. Albert Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, and it was clear from the evidence that the accused lacked common sense. Likewise, Fish's defense attorney sought to prove the defendant's insanity in order to acquit him. During his trial, Fish admitted that he had auditory hallucinations in the form of hundreds of different voices urging him to kill children. Despite the fact that several psychiatrists testified to the truth of the defendant's claim of insanity, the jury found Fish sane enough to find him guilty. Albert Fish's trial lasted 10 days and ended with a verdict that resulted in Fish's execution by electric chair. Before Albert Fish was executed around midnight on January 16, 1936, his defense attorney, Jack Dempsey, refused to release his client's notes. It was clear that what Fish had written in his notes was far too gruesome for the general public to digest. "I would never show these to anyone," Dempsey said. "These were the most obscene acts that I read about in my life." Apparently, Albert Fish was not so afraid of dying, and it was even said that he was impatiently waiting to be executed by electric chair. He even told the guards of the death squad, "What a thrill it will be to die on the electric chair. The maximum excitement I will have, and the only thing I haven't tried."